One angle for trying to understand the gospel properly is the notion of covenant, what might be called a covenant of grace. One way to try to organize the way that God has revealed himself is in terms of two basic covenantal structures. One is a covenant of works that God made with Adam, all humanity being comprehended in him and represented by him. And the offer under that covenant was eschatological life, full spirit-wrought life, confirmed in righteousness and holiness. That was held forth to Adam on the condition of his perfect and personal obedience. And Romans 5 picks up on the covenant of works from the standpoint of its failure. Adam sinned one time and it brought death, Romans 5:12. It brought condemnation, Romans 5:18 and 19. It brought judgment and death for Adam and all of his posterity. So the best way to try to understand the gospel covenantally is to see that instead of leaving humanity to perish in judgment, in death, and in condemnation, God entered into a second covenant, which you can call a covenant of grace. And he promised salvation and life in a second Adam, in a last Adam figure. And Paul picks up on that in 1 Corinthians 15:45. He calls Jesus there the last Adam. He calls him, in comparison to the first Adam, he calls him the second man in verse 47 of 1 Corinthians 15 in comparison to the first man, Adam. And what does this last Adam do? He does two things. He offers the perfect obedience to God's moral law that Adam was required to offer. He does it sinlessly. He does it perfectly in word, in thought, and in deed. When tempted in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, he says to the serpent, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." The second and last Adam, the mediator for this covenant of grace, is sinlessly perfect in his life. But unlike Adam, the first Adam, the mediator, Jesus Christ, must die. He must bear the penal sanctions of God's just wrath against sin. The soul that sins will die. This mediator comes not only to live on behalf of his people, but to die on behalf of his people, to bear their sin, to bear the wrath of God, to redeem them, to reconcile them, and to discharge his office as a surety, as a mediator. Now, what that means then is that Jesus is the one head now of the covenant of grace, and by the active aspect of his obedience, his life, his conforming to God's moral law, the passive aspect of his obedience, his suffering unto death, those are the two fundamental aspects of his one comprehensive obedience on behalf of his people. And it is by the obedience of the one that the many are justified, the many are sanctified, the many are adopted. And this really helps in our reading of the Old Testament and the New Testament, because what are we looking for? We're looking for the gospel of the covenant of grace, where a mediator, a second and last Adam, Abraham's seed, David's greater son, obeys, lives, dies, rises, mediates on behalf of his people. And covenant is a foundational tool that's so helpful in getting clear the nature of the gospel as it focuses on Jesus Christ as a second Adam.